when I started at the Times, again, it was virgin territory, and so I said, well, what do you want to write about? And I remember getting a phone call, but like maybe the first week I was at the paper, or first or second week, saying that a certain artist, R.B. Greaves was the name, had a record called Take a Letter to Maria, Take a Letter to Maria, something about Maria. And they said, why don't you, they have the #1 record this week, why don't you do a story on them? And I said, well, gee, I don't know if that's not a very interesting record, but it's #1, so how do you decide this? Do you write about what's #1 or do you write about what's good? That was one of the really beginnings, practical decisions you have to make. So I said, let me think about it and go home. I'll call you back tomorrow, I told the publicist. And I went home and I said, look, there's 52 different records a year that are #1, okay? So do you want to spend every week writing about what's #1, realizing that half those records are going to be forgotten about 5 years from now? Like, again, I can't think of the title of that album to prove that point, or that song. And I remember back in the 50s, not every record was great. Certainly not every record that was #1 was great. Some of the records I liked the best were never #1 and stuff. And so I called back the publicist and said, look, I don't think that's enough of a reason to write about it just because it's #1. So that was like one really major decision. Don't be intimidated by the charts. Don't just write about what's successful. And so then you have to say, well, what do you write about? And there was a guy I used to read when I was in, I think, college. He was a critic for the San Francisco Chronicle named Ralph Gleason, and he was the co-founder of Rolling Stone magazine. Most people don't know his name, but he was an older guy who was kind of the mentor of Jan Winter, and Jan Winter really respected him and so forth. And I used to go read his columns in the college, in the library, and what struck me about it was that he would always, every week, he would write about somebody who was good, who was interesting, so that even 10 years later, when I was reading these columns, I still cared about that person. I mean, he could write about Miles Davis, he could write about Johnny Cash, he could write about John Lee Hooker, he could write about Sinatra. And so I said, well, that's something that's interesting. So that the goal I kind of set out was that I tested myself. Now, 10 years later, is someone going to want to read about that artist? Is that artist going to matter, or is that artist just going to kind of pass through and no one's really going to care about him? Because the classic example in the 50s was Pat Boone sold probably just as many records as Elvis Presley did for various reasons. But 10 years later, you never heard Pat Boone's name again, roughly, unless it was a kind of a trivia question or a joke. And but Elvis, look at the difference of that. I mean, if you just measured it by who was #1, it wasn't that much difference in the 50s. But if you look at it in the influence, it was a world of difference and so forth. So again, that became the goal. Who is going to last? Who's going to be good? But then, at the same time, you think about all those readers at the LA Times, like say 1 million, 2 million readers a day. They might care about Pat Boone, or they might care about somebody who's selling records. So you don't want to exclude them and kind of be snobbish or elitist. And so you want to try to write about some artists that are popular too, and kind of give your opinions of them, and stuff. Even if you don't like them, it's better than just ignoring them, because the person, if you ignore them, they'll say, well, look, I'm not going to read that person anymore because he's not even talking the same language I am. But if you don't like him, they can say, well, I disagree with that jerk and stuff, and at least it gives a dialogue going. And some of the best conversations I ever had were people would call after a bad review and start screaming and stuff, and I said, wait a second, we disagree over this, but who do you like, and stop, and you'd find some mutual kind of thing. You'd find somebody you agreed upon somewhere in the line. So it really is better to, you want to touch on those artists that aren't very good, but you just don't spend as much time. You don't do as many features on them. You don't do as many reviews of them. You devote most of your time to searching for and writing about the great artists of your time. I think that's the best thing a critic can do, and a person at a paper. So the first thing you want, I think to me the most important thing was finding and evaluating talent. In reviews, and then after you find them, you want to talk about that person, you want to learn about that person, you want to write a feature story to explain to readers and to yourself where that person got their ideas for music, what influenced them, what's their vision, what's their goals, why do they write the way they do. You explain the person, explain the art, and so forth. So that's the second step. The first step is reviewing the person, identifying the really good artists. The second one, then writing about them, telling their story. And there's two ways to do that. There's been some really good pop writers over the years who tell that story in a way that they become the star of the story. They try to write in really colorful language and stuff. But I felt my deal was, I think probably because of my reporting training, was more to try to tell a straightforward story in being true to that, I wanted to capture that artist more important than me trying to make a fancy statement in the writing. I wanted to make sure that artist was portrayed accurately and honestly and sensitively, and so that a reader could kind of get a sense of who that was. I wanted the reader to care more about that artist than they cared about me, in a sense. And so that's the second thing. The feature story, the review is the first thing, I think. The second most important thing is the feature story. And then you have to do kind of news stories once in a while. That seems the least important to me, because that's there's not as much of you in the news story. It's, but if there's something happens that's important, a record company closes, you have to write about that and stuff like that. But so it's mainly, I think, the job of the music journalist is to find the great talents and then write about them. And then the less thing is, pointing out people who aren't good too. That's the other side of pointing out who is good, pointing out who's not good. Kanye West, I think, who I think is a great artist. So you want to point that out. Then you have a person like Mariah Carey, which I don't think she's a great artist and stuff. Even all the Grammys she gets and all the other kind of stuff. So you want to say that because people are curious. What are your views about that person again? So point out. But again, you don't spend most of your time writing about Mariah Carey. You spend most of your time writing about Kanye West.